we're going to talk about, for the first hour and a half, the book that Budd Hopkins wrote called Art, Life, and UFOs, a memoir by Anomalous Books. Art, Life, and UFOs is much more than a UFO book. It's a heartfelt look back at the remarkable career of Budd Hopkins, the renowned abstract expressionist painter whose work can be found in the collections of the Guggenheim, Whitney, and Metropolitan Museums. Oh, that's pretty big, nice places there, as well as Boston's Museum of Fine Arts and New York's Museum of Modern Art. Hopkins not only explains the development of his work and how it would eventually reflect his UFO interests, but friendships with other seniors and artists, as well as the importance of other UFO researchers. Are you there, Budd Hopkins?
I certainly am. I'm glad to be with you.
And you're pitching arms pretty good tonight, huh?
Oh, I guess so.
Yeah, I thought so. You got a good curveball. You know, I'm not trying to exaggerate the abilities there. But you are a good swimmer, aren't you?
Well, you know, I've had a complex time here in my life.
You sure have, and as a matter of fact, we're going to talk about a number of those things. Now, after having written 4 books that are absolutely focused on the UFO abduction phenomenon, why did you decide to write a personal memoir that more or less covers your entire life?
Well, actually, I began to think that there were so many kind of interesting and formative experiences I'd been through, both with how the UFO abduction phenomenon kind of unfolded in my life, and, of course, my life as a painter in New York City and so on. And I thought that to pass on, and of course I'm 78, which is kind of scary, 2 years short of 80, which is a little disturbing. To pass on and have this disappear was just something that I thought was intolerable. I wanted to get it down and get it out because I thought it would be interesting to other people, and also it would explain how my life had its complicated branches intertwined over many, many years.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it certainly has. We're going to start from the very beginning. When you were just a couple of years old, you note that the depredations of polio led you to become an artist. How so? Well,
the polio led me to eventually to become an artist in a very complex way. It's not a straight line. But I contracted polio when I was 2.5. I have almost no memories of that. But I was unable to walk for a year and a half or 2 years. My right leg in a brace and so forth. And I had to, in those years, as a little kid, when I should have been this very active toddler tearing around and getting into trouble, I was restricted to wherever I was put by my mother and my father. Mm-hmm. And I had to kind of invent a world that was not any farther away than my length of my arms and my fingertips. And I began to make things and sketch, make terrible drawings and scroll as a little child and so forth. And I think that somehow when you're thrown back on your own inner resources like this, it's just a straight line from that to becoming an artist. Living in a world where I had a studio, and within those 4 walls, eventually, I made my art, was like an adult version of living somewhere in a playroom with my arms reaching out to do make whatever I could make close to me. So I think there's something in that, and also to turn it around upside down, the idea that other kids and normal people and so forth, and my sister and brother, were mobile and active and so on, made me feel somehow that my own body, my own physicality was not to be trusted. First of all, it was pretty terrible when I was very small with the brace on my leg and so on. So I didn't get involved in physical things easily. So ultimately, when one thing led to another, I ended as an artist.
Well, as you noted, you exercised your creativity the way other people exercise their arms and legs, learning to use my developing imagination to build a complex. And then another aspect of it, we're going to stay in your childhood just a little bit more, okay? How did the order of your miniature domain affect your aesthetic of the paintings you did later on in life?
Well, that's a very interesting thing, and something I didn't really examine until I began writing this book. And one of the things, Dr. Bob, about writing a memoir is that things that have been just you've placed on some kind of really back shelf of your mind to gather dust. Suddenly you blow off the dust and take that thing out and examine it and say, "Yeah, I never realized that." And this is what happened. I began to remember that when I was very little, that my mother would plump me down outside. This was on a trip to Florida where they took me to exercise my leg. Florida was seen as the cure for everything. So
still is. It is the cure.
I was taken down there, and anyway, they would plump me down in this little yard, and there was a very sharp edge to the sidewalk and a very sharp edge to where the little plants started in this front yard and so on. And I began to really enjoy edges and sharp distinctions between one area and another area. And I realized that was very strong with me. As a matter of fact, a very peculiar thing is I can drive by a certain kind of house nowadays, and this happens rarely, but I'll look over at a house, and there's some way in which the driveway has been lined with stones to make a very clear edge, and there are very precise plantings which define one area and another, and I get a kind of little thrill at the definition. And I really think that this idea of clarity and definitions and edges was with me from those early years, and it became an element when I started to paint what are called more hard-edge paintings. I began to really exult in the idea of separations and boundaries.
Well, these are great insights. I wish many of us could have those kind of insights as to when we were 2.5 years old and what effect it is. I mean, that is really, it seems very rational and seems very reasonable, but still at the same time, it's great to know that maybe that's what I became an artist when I was sitting in the bathtub, I put glasses on Donald Duck. I drew them on there, and I knew it. I knew right then that was it. But anyway, now
I think you're kidding, but the point is, what you've got to do, Dr. Bob, you've got to write your own memoir, and you'll understand the phenomenon.
Well, that's you're reading our minds, because that's exactly what we have been working on. Now, Orson Welles radio. We're going to stay. You're still about somewhere around 11 years old. I think 9 or 11.
8 years old.
Oh, sorry. Orson Welles.
Excuse me, 7. It was 1938, and I was born 31.
Okay, all right. You're 7 years old. Orson Welles' radio program, War of the Worlds, affected your personal views about the acceptance of UFOs being extraterrestrial. How come? What happened?
Right. Well, what happened was I had been put to bed and so on, and I began to hear phones ring in my parents' bedroom and whispered worried remarks and so on, and suddenly I realized something very bad was happening. And at 7, of course, you don't know very much about bad things. But what happened was my parents came into my room my father wanted to look out the window to see what he could see. They had been told to listen to this program by some neighbor, and the whole town, the whole culture in a way was absolutely shaken up by this. And my mother was weeping. She was in a state of panic. And I heard somebody say the world's coming to an end. And, you can't imagine how that affects a 7-year-old. Sure. I don't know what that means exactly, but it's terrible. And ultimately, when it emerged that this had been a hoax, essentially, that's to put the worst possible adjective noun attached to it. hoax rather than just a straight radio play. There was this entire, practically nationwide revulsion against Orson Welles and against the program. There were stories, I don't know that they were ever confirmed, that people committed suicide or people had heart attacks and so forth because of the realism of the program. And one of the things that happened in my own personal life was to realize that my father, who I always thought was a rock and, brave and so forth, I saw him as being a terrified person. Although he was putting a great face on it, but
your father was a colonel. Your father was a colonel in the army.
He'd been at that point. He'd been in World War I. This is 1938, and he was very brave. And he had a Purple Heart and ribbons and so forth, medals. And he was scared to death. And my mother had just completely collapsed into tears and panic. And just to give you an idea, which I mentioned in the book, he had gotten a phone call during this program from an employee of his who begged my father, to put the family in a car and join him with rifles and ammunition. Mr. Buck, the employee, had packed the car with his, I'm sure, weeping wife and terrified kids, and he had boxes of ammunition and rifles and food, and he was going up on top of a very high hill to make a stand. Wanted my father to come, which my father, thank God, didn't do. But it gives you an idea of how this affected people. And my basic thought about this was, which is, I think, important for the UFO phenomenon, perhaps it's been overlooked a little too much, was that in 1947, which was only 9 years later, at Roswell, and in 47, when there were so many reports of UFOs, nobody wanted to accept the idea that there was anything real about this that was extraterrestrial, because having been fooled once, nobody wanted to be fooled twice. And so I think that in a strange way, the Orson Welles program set back the acceptance of the UFO phenomenon amongst the public many, many years. It was a very destructive thing in retrospect.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's really a good insight, because I know most other UFO researchers never would have conceived that might be a problem at all. But it made you feel like these kind of things are basically hoaxes to begin with, so why worry about them at all? It was, as you note in the book, it's the same kind of thing that we went through with 8 years of there's no such thing as global warming. Yeah, and now many people are feeling that that there is none, and they're going to be pretty surprised. As if we're not already surprised watching the weather patterns change all over the planet. We're going to take our break here with Budd Hopkins, Art, Life, and UFOs, a memoir, Anomalous Books. Order from Amazon by clicking the link at 21stcenturyradio.com.
This is John Schuessler, International Director for the Mutual UFO Network, and you are listening to the 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Okay, now, here we find you're going to college now. I just love the story of your college situation and how your dad got fooled with that, but we can't get into that. That was great. There's a lot of humor in this book. Well, Oberlin College introduced you to 20th century arts and Kerouac. How did this affect your life when bumping into Kerouac and other folks there at Oberlin? Well,
the thing is, Dr. Bob, that as a kid and as a teenager and so forth, I was always drawing, and I drew during World War II. I drew Messerschmitts and hurricanes and Mustangs and airplanes and so forth. And I used to draw portraits of members of my family, as I said in the book, mostly my grandmother, because she was asleep a lot, and so she was a great model. But the point is that I didn't know anything about art, capital A art. I didn't know anything about, shall we say, Cézanne or Picasso or Van Gogh or, you name it. I think I'd heard the name Rembrandt. But when I got to Oberlin, not knowing what I was going to major in, I stumbled into an art history class. And a friend of mine said, it's great, you go in and you look at these nice pictures, you can go to sleep if you need to. And I walked into this class, and the first lecture was on Corot, and I was totally blown away. These things were so beautiful. And the man giving the lecture, named Seymour Slive, was such a kind of charismatic speaker. And I'm looking at all these things, and what I started to do was to copy the slides quickly, sketches, as they went by, which is quite a job because you don't know how long something's going to be on the screen. And I suddenly discovered the seriousness of art and how important so many major figures were. And I realized that this is not something that's just a hobby like I had been treating it in my life, but this was one of the most important things anybody could do. And I started at that point. I started working as an artist and sketching and drawing, and I took art courses, and I took everything I could take at Oberlin that had to do with art, even a philosophy course. And Robert Motherwell came out to give some lectures and on contemporary art, and showed slides of Willem de Kooning and Franz Klein and Jackson Pollock, Robert and Rothko and so forth, and Mondrian. And I was totally captivated because I didn't know anything about any of this. This was, say, 1952. And, God, it's, 57 years ago, if my math is correct. And
just a half a century ago.
Yes, at least. I didn't do too well in math. But at any rate, I just, at that point, knew I was an artist. That was it. And that's when I really started working intensely on my own.
Well, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about abstract expressionism in just a minute, but at college, you became involved with the fundamentalist Christianity. How did Van Gogh, there's so many ways I've heard to pronounce his last name, but I'm not going to spit it out. I'm just going to say, how did Van Gogh disengage you from that?
Well, this is, of course, a fairly long story, which I go into at length, how I got involved in sort of essentially moral issues that I interpreted in a religious framework, which was a mistake, as I realized in retrospect. And when I got to Oberlin, there was this group of fundamentalists who kind of gravitated to young students who were lonely and didn't know anybody and so on, like me. And so I was kind of brought into this fold, not in an intense way, but it waxed and waned, and sometimes I would be very involved, sometimes I wouldn't be. But as my whole world of seeing art and practicing art became more intense, I remember asking one of these sort of leaders who was attached to the school. He was an adult. And their whole thing was whether or not you believed in Jesus or not, or you wouldn't go to heaven if you didn't. And then I began talking about Van Gogh. And I said I didn't think that he had ever, as it were, taken the pledge. And would he go to heaven or not? And because I had this enormous respect for him as a great humanist. And they said, no, if he didn't take the pledge, he's going to burn in hell. And that did it. I thought, I'm not going to be involved with an organization that puts that kind of absolute joining up and taking pledges and so forth as a mark of going to heaven rather than burning in hell. So I was out the door, thanks to Van Gogh, in a strange way.
Well, you know, as you not just burn in hell, you burn in hell forever.
Yep.
I mean, that's a long time.
That's a long time.
For making a series of mistakes in one particular lifetime, that doesn't, to me, I've never thought that was too fair. But
yeah, right.
But we don't make the rules and regulations. But
that's right.
But you know, I think the one's actions in assisting and helping other people, service to others, selfless service, which you have performed 1,592 times, I understand, is much more important to me than that, thinking that that's the way to get in. I know Thomas Jefferson didn't think that, and that's one of the reasons why he did what he did with his Bible. So,
yes.
Let's listen to what Jesus said, not let's listen to what everybody else said that Jesus said. There's a big difference there. Okay, now, you mentioned Robert Motherwell and abstract expressionism. Tell us about that particular style, or that, I wouldn't want to call it a style, but that type of consciousness, the abstract expressionists in art.
Right. The thing is about abstract expressionist painting was it was the first kind of innovative movement in American art after the many movements that Europe had gone through: Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Cubism, Fauvism, etc. American art was sort of in the shadow of Europe, but abstract expressionism, which really started in a certain sense in the late 40s and reached a peak in the early 50s, which is the time I was involved with it most intensely, was a way in which you painted abstractly and you painted rather impulsively out of gestures and marks, which you ultimately were able to structure into a composition which was emotional, filled with energy, and apparently, hopefully, expressed your values. These paintings were a way in which you were somehow expressing your deepest feelings on canvas, not through imagery that was realistic, no still lifes or whatnot, but this was a way in which just forms and colors and the impulse of the marks that you put down were an index into the kind of person you were, the emotion you felt. And I know this sounds very ephemeral and so forth, but in a way, a lot of people made the analogy with music that, Mozart didn't sit down with a symphony and say, this is supposed to be a bubbling brook, or this is a motorcycle starting up, or this is people talking or something. It was pure music, and abstract expressionism was, in a certain sense, pure painting. And it showed a way out for somebody, for me as a young artist. It gave me a way of making paintings that were, as far as I was concerned, authentic to my inner feelings. And I know this sounds hopelessly soft and vague, but it really wasn't.
Well, it doesn't sound, no, I don't think so, Bud. I think it doesn't sound soft and vague, especially because of your experience and personally knowing and working under, studying, befriending some of the greatest, in my opinion, some of the greatest artists that ever lived on this planet. 1952, artist Robert Motherwell came to Oberlin, and you made a connection with him. As a matter of fact, a lasting connection with him. How would you look at Robert Motherwell in relationship to other abstract expressionists?
Well, Motherwell was, first of all, an extremely intelligent man. I mean, one would call him an intellectual. And, very often people refer to artists and intellectuals as if they're two different groups. And with him, he was absolutely both. He was a Harvard graduate. He had studied philosophy. He came from a very wealthy background. He was a very gracious and a very complex person. And I didn't connect with him on a personal way until many years later. The funny thing was, when I got to New York, which is what I wanted to do immediately after I graduated from Oberlin, I met many of the other abstract expressionists who I became friendly with, Franz Klein in particular, Mark Rothko. I had my paths crossed with Jackson Pollock and so forth, although he was in terrible shape when I got to New York. But I didn't get connected with Motherwell until many years later. But he was, as far as I was concerned, an extremely literate, interesting man on many, many levels.
Well, there was a bar, the Cedar Bar, that actually, I guess you might call it like a home for the many abstract expressionists. And you provide so many insights into the lives and tragedies of many of these abstract expressionist legends. Mark Rothko, boy, what you revealed there, and examining his work, and then and getting into it possibly being related to the graves in Russia. Really, wow, that really got me.
Yeah, well, that's an insight that I think hasn't been recognized as it should. Although the biography written about Roscoe, when they interviewed me, that was included, that particular anecdote. But the point is that everybody was poor, everybody was broke, everybody felt very isolated in 1953 when I first got to New York, and the Cedar Bar was a sort of a refuge, or clubhouse or something. It was sort of like, I suppose, some of the cafes were for the Cubists, or before that, the Impressionists and so on in France. But it was a kind of amazing place. There are many, many extremely funny stories.
You had some great ones in there. You really did. But I was going to mention something about Jackson Pollock there, but you gave me insight into this artist that I just never, and a lot of laughter as he gets introduced to various young ladies and approaches them in different ways.
Yeah.
And I guess when he had to go to the men's room, he went to the men's room. There's nothing about that. I mean, right? But I'm so tempted to spend the rest of our program on these individuals. But we got to move on to another most important aspect of your life work in UFOs, and we're going to take our break here. And when we come back, I'm going to quiz you. I hope you can remember this part. Okay? You can remember all your book, can't you? I hope you can.
I think I can.
All right, but but you note that in the New York art world, there was a general indifference to politics and non-visual arts. You really educated the hell out of me in regards to this, as well as finally I understood why the abstract expressionists and the Beats didn't have much in common at all, which shocked me a long time ago, but now I can understand it a little bit better, and we're going to find out those things when our guest Budd Hopkins returns. Art, Life, and UFOs, because we're getting into the UFOs part of it, friends. It's a memoir, Anomalous Books. You can order from Amazon by clicking the link on 21stcenturyradio.com.
Hello, this is nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, the original investigator of the Roswell incident. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Welcome back. Our guest is Budd Hopkins, Art, Life, and UFOs, a memoir, Anomalous Books. Go to 21stcenturyradio.com and click on that, and you'll find the book. Who's doing that music there? What is that? It's not the... It's not Tommy Dorsey. Who is that? Dr. Kortner. Oh, Jean-Michel. Oh, yeah. 8 years of French, and I can't even speak it. Well, Budd,
yes.
Did you do enough studying for this to answer this question? You note that in the New York art world, there was a general indifference to politics and the non-visual arts. Why?
Well, I think that one of the things that happened was that artists were afraid to vote because you had to give your address, and most people were living in illegally zoned loft buildings, which meant that they were, if they were caught, they could be evicted. And that gave a very powerful reason not to register to vote.
Yeah, I'll say.
That was one thing. Mm-hmm. And second, of course, when I got to New York, it was the beginning of the Eisenhower administration, and I think everybody was pretty depressed about that. And nobody had any kind of enthusiasm for Eisenhower Nixon, and so it just sort of got relegated to the sidelines for most people. And
I always thought that I guess that I'm 11 years younger than you are. So I always thought that, because every time I went up to the village, it was a little bit different, and that's for sure. That the abstract expressionists and the Beats would have had a lot in common, but they don't really. They don't.
Well, I think everybody sort of stuck with painting as the central thing. there were artists who were involved with poetry, and a few, and a number of them were readers, but there were a number who I never saw with a book ever.
Yeah.
So it's I think it was just, it's funny. I have over the years met a few classical musicians, and I have found in my tiny little sample of whom I met that there wasn't a huge amount of reading going on or political involvement amongst classical musicians. They practice all day and perform all night. And I think artists are like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you had an experience with Jack Kerouac, and you nearly came to blows with him. And I think he kind of represented the kind of conduct one has in relationship to when one becomes famous.
Yeah.
Not necessarily good, but famous. Would you care to say anything about that particular experience?
Well, it's just a ships that pass in the night kind of thing. But I was at a party with my new wife, and we were both pretty young. She was probably 19 or so, and I was 24, 25, 26, whatever. And Kerouac was there with some of his cohorts, and he started, as they say, hitting on Joan. And when I was not present, I was getting a drink or something. And when I came back, he more or less asked me to leave, get away, because he had the most attractive youngest woman there. He was carrying on, and she was quite terrified. So I said, "This is my wife," and I took her by the arm, and he started. He was pretty drunk, carrying on, and following me as if he was going to start a fight. Now, there's an interesting coda to this. Recently, I met again a musician at whose house I think this was. Now I'm trying to think of his name. But at any rate, we were comparing notes, and he had been a very close friend of Kerouac's. And when I told him this story, because it had happened in his apartment, he said, "Bud, I knew him extremely well, and I spent many, many hours doing exactly the same thing, trying to prevent a fight and pull him away from somebody who he was, as they say, hitting on." I think it was just a kind of arrogance that he was the big star, and he on the road had been written and so forth. He might have been a very decent person when he wasn't drunk or something, but I never saw that aspect because I didn't know him.
Well, I don't think too many people saw that side of him. No, he was really, for some peculiar reason, before I read your book, I just listened again to On the Road, and I just was just it's amazing what I forgot about it. How much I forgot about it, and what a messed up group of folks they were at that particular time. They were. Yeah, I mean, their whole ethical whatever's just was out the window as far as I was concerned. Now, we're going to get back to UFOs for good. Your first UFO sighting happened in August 1964.
Yeah.
What happened?
I think I should say my first and only.
Okay, you can say that. Well, go ahead. You can tell us about it?
Right. This was in 1964, and at that point I had absolutely no knowledge of the subject or interest in it or anything. And I was driving on Cape Cod to Provincetown for a party with my wife and a friend who was visiting us. And we all were chatting away, and suddenly it became clear that we'd sort of stopped talking and we're looking up in the air. And this was 5 in the afternoon, a very clear day, and there was this object, which from our point of view on high ground, it looked lens-shaped in silhouette. And it was like a dull aluminum in color. And it was apparently hovering or moving very slowly. And we started what is that thing, And as we moved ahead and went down to lower ground, we were at that point looking up at it from a steeper angle, and it looked circular from underneath. And we were very perplexed and getting more and more curious, and I was going very slow in the car. And suddenly the thing started to move, and I stopped the car. We were going very slowly anyway. We all jumped out, and this thing zoomed off into the clouds that were coming in from the ocean. And that's when somebody said, you suppose that was one of those flying saucers you used to hear about? I mean, nobody had any idea. And in retrospect, as we drove away, we were all excited and talking about it, like, what was that thing? And it was able to move straight into the wind at the speed of an airplane. So this wasn't a balloon or anything, and but it had no identifying features. So when we went to the party in Provincetown, we excitedly told some people, friends, about what we'd seen, and suddenly 2 or 3 friends were saying, gee, 3 years ago I saw such and such. And I found that a number of people had had similar kinds of sightings. And I thought, what's going on here? Is this some sort of real thing, phenomenon that we didn't know about? And that really sort of lit the fuse under me, I suppose. And what I did from that point on, from 64 until 75, when I got really, really involved actively, was I watched everything that turned up on television. I read whatever books I could find to give myself more information. The more I read about it, the more I realized this is real. These things are real. They're flying around. And I was pretty convinced when I first saw it that this thing was so unusual that it wasn't some kind of earthly manifestation, airplane or anything.
Mm. Well, as you note, you said, from the vantage of the present, I can easily see an analogy with my continuing interest in UFOs in 1964 and the indifference almost everyone else displayed, particularly those colleagues of mine in the art world.
Yep, absolutely.
And that's still happening today.
Yeah, right. But it was very upsetting that I'm thinking, here is this, like possibly enormous issue. Possibly very enormous issue.
Yeah, like one of the greatest issues, period.
Absolutely, and I couldn't get very many people to be interested either. One of my friends said, well, Bud, it's not that I don't believe you, but he said, until I can kick the tires on one of those things, I won't believe it.
That's right. Well, he's not going to get a chance to do that because I don't think they got any tires to kick.
I don't think so. Now,
we're going to need, obviously, we just have a few seconds. Is that right? No, about 30 seconds. When we return, looking into this UFO, that particular UFO sighting may have affected your painting. We need to touch on that. And then the November 1975 George Obarski UFO encounter in North Hudson Park. We need to check that oil, as we used to say back in the old days. With Budd Hopkins, Art, Life, and UFOs, a memoir, Anomalous Books, you can order from Amazon by clicking the link on 21stcenturyradio.com. Our guest for the next 20-some minutes is Budd Hopkins, Art, Life, and UFOs, a memoir, Anomalous Books. You can order from Amazon by clicking the link on 21stcenturyradio.com. And also, gosh, Rudy, Bud, we got this, it's not an email. This is off the web of a new UFO documentary from James Fox. I'm sure you know all about this, right?
Oh, yeah, I do. Mm-hmm.
It's called I Know What I Saw.
Yep.
You want to say anything about it?
Well, I've seen it, and it has a kind of focus on the press conference that James Fox and Leslie Kean organized in November of 2007 in Washington, and it has parts of that press conference which are so important because the people who were speaking were officials. Government people. There were 2 generals retired, people from, I think, as I remember, 7 or 8 different countries. And their segments are going to be in that film. And, of course, it's also going to be kind of a history of how the UFO phenomenon unfolded in the United States and worldwide. And it's very well done, and I highly recommend it. It's going to be I think, a major film.
Okay, that opens. It's going to be on tonight. I guess it may have been started, but it's also on tomorrow night as well on the History Channel. Thank you, Bud. Now, we talked about your first UFO sighting. How might have this UFO sighting affected your painting?
Well, I think one of the things that I began doing, and I didn't really in my painting, and I didn't really connect it with the UFO phenomenon, was that I sort of calmed the painting down and made it the compositions a little more orderly, a little more hierarchical. And the interesting thing was that they, for the next 20 years, were dominated more or less by a circle as a central form. Some of those circles, they were all different. Some of them in the early examples, and some of those are reproduced in my book, had a big black circle in the center with some forms kind of speeding into it. And the black circle could be read either as a hole in the painting that you're looking into, or a black thing on top of the other forms. I mean, I deliberately jiggled the space of the painting in such a way that it was extremely ambiguous. And I had the German actor Maximilian Schell, who had bought some paintings of mine, said that he really thought that the UFO experience had influenced the work. And I said, I don't think so. The artists don't like to admit that anything influenced them.
Well, nothing's ever influenced me in all my life.
Oh, of course not.
No.
It doesn't happen.
It's all original thinking.
Yeah.
I think the president's trying to reach you right about now.
Yeah, that's an accident.
Yeah, President Obama.
But the point is that I think that no, I put him on hold.
Yeah, good thing.
but the thing is that I believe that there was some sort of a spillover from those experiences into the paintings. And what happened is my paintings began to get a little more structured and calmer, as if they were a little more classical and emotionally steady than they had been before. In a strange way, that happened after the sighting instead of the opposite. One might have thought that it went the other way around, that it was I would have gotten very discombobulated after the sighting in the work, but the opposite happened. And ultimately, I started making temples, guardians, and altars.
Awesome.
And
wow.
so those forms all really kind of came from the way my work had been developing anyway. There's nothing magical about that. But I do think there was an influence.
Yeah, and once again, how fortunate to know what those influences are. I think that most artists would have died before they figured that out. Really, because they don't, just like you say in the book repeatedly, that many artists do not ever want to talk about what influences them, or that, in fact, if anything, influences them. But we're always been influenced.
De Kooning, who was a very sharp, sly man, when he was asked what artist influenced him, and he said all of them.
That's good. That's a good one.
You can't get around that. That's pretty good.
That is pretty good. But in November 1975, George Obarski, and he was quite a character. I really enjoyed reading this stuff. You're a good writer.
Well, he was a remarkable guy.
And he had a UFO encounter in North Hudson Park. Tell us what happened.
Well, George Obarski had a little liquor store across the street from me on 16th Street. And I used to go in there and get my wine for dinner and all that. And he was a big talker, but in a funny way. He was always complaining and griping and so forth, usually about politics. And we never, ever mentioned anything about UFOs or art. I mean, two subjects I felt he had no interest in. And one day I walked in and he said, I don't know what, he was pacing around behind his counter. He said, I don't know what the world's coming to. A man could be coming home at night and this thing can come down and land next to his car and scare you half to death. And I said, what's that, George? And what unfolded was an incredible experience in a landing of an object of UFO, roughly 35 feet in diameter, something like that, in a park on the Jersey shore, the Jersey Palisades, right opposite about 86th Street in Manhattan. I mean, this is like 1 mile from Broadway, literally. And these figures got out and dug soil samples in seconds while he's in his car looking dumbfounded. And then the thing took off, and he had some very colorful ways of describing what happened and how it looked and so forth. He described the little figures that got out. He said in one piece where he was some kind of one-piece outfit, he said they looked like kids in snowsuits. And very interestingly, I have run into 2 later accounts of the same kind of saying, oh, well, these were actually abduction accounts. It seemed to be. And in these 2 later accounts amongst, thousands, the witnesses said that they looked like kids in snowsuits. And, of course, what's interesting here is that the honesty of that is that you take something that's unbelievable and you reduce it down to something that you're trying to help the person see what you saw. And so you use a sort of a childish or dumb image. If you're trying to do the opposite, you might say, and you're making it up, they were beautiful and they had long flowing hair and robes and they this and that.
That's the kind I like, Bud.
That's the kind you like.
No,
but you know right away you're in trouble because what they're doing is kind of elevating the thing to some level a godlike level that is going to be very impressive. But to say that it looked like kids in snowsuits is to, is to kind of reduce the thing in such a way that shows you're really telling the truth. And incidentally, just one thing I would like to mention, I didn't put this in the book, but when there was a television program done about this sighting, it became a very big story because there was another witness who saw the whole thing from another point of view, a doorman. And George was interviewed on this program, and it was not a program with an audience, so I was not on the program. I was standing out around watching it. And I said to George when he's going on, I said, George, they might try to question your honesty or something. And I said, tell them immediately about the other witness who confirmed what you saw, and describe what the witness said he saw. So when George was on the program, the rather smarmy interviewer said, well, I got to ask you these things, Mr. Barsky. Is there any insanity in your family, or is there any alcoholism, and these sorts of things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And did you really see this? And George, and I'm sitting back there thinking, George, tell him about the other witness. And George looks this man in the face and he says, well, I tell you, he said, I'm 72 years old, or whatever he was. And he said, I've lived a long life, and a man doesn't live a long life and tries to be as honest as he can be, and then throws it all away by making up something. He said, I saw this. Mm-hmm. And he did not rely on another person to back up his story. He just, and I can tell you that when he said this, it was a lot more eloquent and emotional than I'm making it. But when he said this, the cameramen and so on were turning to each other and kind of, doing the little circle with their thumb and forefinger and waving their hands like, gee, that's great.
Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, maybe in the same show or something close to it, UFO bunkers, as you know, are the least studied and least knowledgeable about UFO research. And after the Village Voice article you wrote on the North Hudson Park case, you turned the table on a skeptic who told you why UFOs can't possibly exist. Your answer was classic. We've got to do a write-up and put this in a book. Well, maybe we'll just use your book all the time. But what did you say to him? This was quite an inspiration.
Well, this was on a radio program, and the guy was saying, look, this can't have happened. You can't, whatever your UFO, space travel is impossible. You can't get here from there. And even if you could, the spacecraft would not be round like you're describing these things, you know, blah, blah, blah. And the figures wouldn't look like that, and they wouldn't take soil samples and so on. These are the reasons why this didn't happen. And he was posing as the skeptic. And I said to him, well, you know, it seems to me like in terms of skepticism that I'm the skeptic and you're the true believer. You know before you've heard anything about this case that it couldn't have happened because you have this list of beliefs about space travel and what they would look like and what they would or would not do. And I said, I don't really know any of those things. I have to look into these cases to find out whether there's anything to support them or not. So I said, I'm the skeptic who's trying the evidence, and you're the true believer who knows in advance that it didn't happen.
That was precious. That really was. That's got to be. But then again, there is the curious case of Dr. Carl Sagan.
Oh, boy.
Yes, I know. And we're running out of time, but we got to definitely touch on this and a little bit on Hynek and a little on Leslie Kean. But Dr. Carl Sagan, please review the two faces of Dr. Carl Sagan and why you think he couldn't act truthfully.
Well, the thing is, I don't really know what Sagan really did know or not know about the subject. But when we were on a program together and he approached me in the green room, it's a long story I go into in the book, but he used the skeptic's favorite mantra, which is extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And I said, well, Carl, I think what we have to say about this phenomenon is this extraordinary phenomenon with all of the reports, the photographs, the astronaut sightings, the pilot and everything, all of this evidence. Whatever you think about the evidence, it is an extraordinary phenomenon. He said yes. And I said, well, shouldn't we be saying instead that the extraordinary phenomenon demands an extraordinary investigation?
Of course, yeah.
And you say that to a scientist, and you really put him on the spot. Because all he's sort of left with is, I don't know enough about the evidence, or he just sort of mutters and so forth. But he was, I think, really thrown by that. And actually, when I began the Intruders Foundation, that became our slogan: "An extraordinary phenomenon demands an extraordinary investigation." And how can any scientist kind of put that down?
Well, then he agreed with you that if there was an important case, a really good case, you contact him and he'll work on it with you. And of course,
he'll look into it with me. And I waited till I got a case of a student actually at Cornell where he was teaching, and it was a very, very good case and a very touching letter and so forth. And so I sent a copy with the student's permission to Sagan, and I put out, I thought, a very generous proposal that we get together and we can look into this. And I said, if there's any kind of hypnosis that would be involved, I said, you can get somebody from the psychology department to do it. I don't have to do it. I just want to be there. And I said, we'll just work together on this. And I said, whatever we learn and whatever you learn, it's going to be helpful, to both of us. And he sent me about a month later, like this little short reply saying he didn't find this an interesting case. The man had a scar on his leg from the incident, and it's a whole long, complicated thing, but he was just bowing out because it was better for him to kind of pontificate on television and sort of tut the whole subject and so forth than it was to actually get his hands dirty by looking into something.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you remember Phil Klass, but Phil Klass had some real classics, like the one I thought was a really classic one, was when something was brought up about UFO piece of evidence. Phil Klass would say, yeah. I've got the answer to that, but it's in the glove compartment of my car outside, and we don't have time to go out and get it. And, of course, at the end of the show, they said, okay, go get it. He said, well, it's not out there. And they said, you made it up? He said, well, I thought it was out there, but now I realize I didn't have it there.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, he was, I have to say this. I don't like to speak ill of my fellow human beings, But this man was essentially despicable, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think he was worse than despicable. I mean, I think you heard, you read what NASA wrote about him after he passed on as being most unreliable. And yet,
absolutely.
They were referring. He was all over. He was all over the media. I'm sorry.
Right. Well, when I quoted something, outrageous that he had said to Carl Sagan, I said, "Your man, class," and Sagan immediately sort of put up his hand. He said, "He's not my man."
Yeah.
Like he didn't want to be connected with him.
Now, you had a wonderful relationship with J. Allen Hynek,
Yep.
but there was something that really was adorable. He related to you, "Damn it, Bud, you make a strong case for abductions, and I don't like it, because I don't accept it." I don't accept it more easily if I thought the aliens made mistakes. And after his passing, you discovered aliens made a lot of mistakes.
Many mistakes.
Yeah. So what kind of mistakes were they making?
Well, putting the wrong clothes on the wrong people, back to the group of people. And when they dressed them, they put the wrong shirt on somebody. One of the more amusing and sad, weird things was a woman I'd worked with who had she'd bought a new, rather lacy nightgown from Victoria's Secret. And when she woke up, after remembering certain things that happened, she was wearing this big, bulky green man's T-shirt, which made us wonder how the guy woke up,
I like the one with the earrings, too.
Can
you imagine
so many?
Yeah. Can you imagine all of a sudden inheriting diamond and gold earrings when you just had plastic ones? Well, that's just wonderful. We're about out of time. I'm so sorry. There are so many good parts in this book. Dr. John Mack, you noted he regarded the physical evidence of UFOs such as scoop marks as worthless, which I thought to be really strange. Really strange. I don't quite understand that one.
Yeah,
but
I don't either.
Let's end, though, with Leslie Kean. You noted what her important work before.
Absolutely.
Leslie Kean, what are her contributions to that landmark 2007 International Press Conference in about a minute? Can you do it in a minute?
She actually got these people together, and together with James Fox, but she did all the legwork, really. And what she got, as an example, was an Iranian general, Parviz Jafari, who had been involved in a famous kind of dogfight over Tehran in 1976 with UFO, and she got Commandante Oscar Santamaria from Peru, who had been in the same kind of a dogfight over a major Peruvian air base a few years later, and we sat around at the dinner table where the two of them, Santamaria was being translated, Jafari spoke English, were comparing like two old RAF fighter pilots about what happened and what their planes did and how these things maneuvered and so forth. It was absolutely stunning. And she is working on a book on all of these major political figures and generals and so forth. I think her book is going to have 5 generals' testimony in it.
Good heavens! Yeah.
So it'll be coming out next summer, and you're going to have her on the program. It's really a major piece of work.
So that her work and that accomplishment is part of that new UFO documentary of I Know What I Saw.
Absolutely, they work together closely. And incidentally, let me ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
Did you enjoy reading the book?
I loved it. I had a great time. And you see, with my insane schedule, I had to read your entire book, and I did it in one day. Now, I'm not a fast reader, but there were parts of it that were so funny. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to many of the other parts of it. Your love lives is just wonderful. I mean, that was a movie in itself.
I wanted the book to be enjoyable and have all of the texture of my life, including the bad stuff and the intimate stuff and the funny stuff and the UFO stuff and the art stuff and the on and the political, all of these things. Because I felt a responsibility to the reader that I wanted this to be a good experience for them, and that's what I've hoped. That's why I asked the question.
Well, I had a wonderful experience all day. It took me 12 hours racing against the time, not answering any phone calls and everything, but it was really just extraordinary. And then, once again, when it was over, I was sorry it was over. I wish you would have written 600 more pages, because of the story qualities. And I remember some of the places up in New York you were talking about, and that really that really excited me a great deal to think about those kind of things. Thank you for joining us, Bud. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, thank you.
And get a haircut and shine your shoes.
Okay.
Are you wearing a tie tonight?
No, well, I'm going to hang by my thumbs.
Okay. Okay. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington. And I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus.